still remember being a college kid, smitten by the Hero Honda CBZ, that sporty silhouette, those tank shrouds, that upswept exhaust. It was stuff of dreams for kids like me. But in 2001 came the Bajaj Pulsar. It had a simple round headlight, but that iconic tank, that pointy tail, and more importantly, the number on that tail, 180. That still gives me goosebumps. It's 20 years since. Times have changed. Definitely male sounds sexist today. And a 250cc badge? Well, I think it doesn't stir up the same kind of emotions anymore. And yet, the whole world sits up and takes notice when there is a new Bajaj Pulsar in town. In fact, this time, there are two. These are based on the Pulsar's tried and tested body styles, a street naked in the N250 and the quarter-fed F250. They won't replace any of the existing Pulsars right away, but this design theme is likely to spawn smaller Pulsars in the coming years. Let me talk about a few design bits that I don't like. For example, these panel gaps. You see the gap here versus the gap here. Inconsistent gaps, and I don't quite like it. But again, I think these are pre-production prototypes. That's what Bajaj has said. So hopefully with the production bike, this is not going to happen. However, if you look at this motorcycle, if you look at the headlamp and the housing around it, it's all plastic. And then you have the plastic bits here. You also have this plastic panel here on top. So now the problem with all of this is that, well, even on the production motorcycle, in places like Bombay, these plastics are going to get blemished very easily. They're going to pick up those water stains, they are going to get blemished, they are going to look aged. And I think that is a bit of a downer. They should have reduced the use of plastics of these kind, at least in the common visible areas. Now, looking at the walk around and the comments that you guys have posted on it, I can also see that some of you think this one looks too much like the FZ25 or the MT15. That one looks like an evolution of the Pulsar AS or the Discover 150 and not so much the Pulsar 220. Now, I'll say that those arguments aren't completely baseless. I'll also say that yes, design is a personal preference, but now that I've spent time with these two motorcycles, that design is sort of growing on me. I am appreciating all the details that you can see, and I think these are very handsome bikes. That brings me to things that I like about the motorcycle. For example, if you look here on the mud flap, you will see these floating panel kind of designs that they've created with this two-piece layout. Similarly, if you look at the belly pan down there, again, they have created that floating kind of an effect there. And if you look at the tail section, again, you see a bit of a repetition of that with this black and the colored panel. It stands out much better on the red color. So this floating effect, I think it looks quite good. Since I mentioned color, the paint finish, I think has improved quite a bit over the outgoing Pulsars. I think this is now the best paint finish that we've seen on Bajaj motorcycles. But to continue with a bit of nitpicking, I think they should have stuck to the whole minimalist ideology that we've seen with Pulsar designs over the years. They should have done that even with these two motorcycles. We complained with the RS that the graphics were a bit overdone, and unfortunately, even with these two motorcycles, especially on the red shades on either of the motorcycles, the graphics are a bit overdone. Otherwise, I think these are two really handsome motorcycles that look new age, look up with the times. I believe that Bajaj should have stuck to a two-pot vertical arrangement for the F250's headlight to go with the theme that was set by the 220F. But the single projector bi-beam LED was chosen to keep costs low. The throw and the spread of these headlights are pretty average on both the motorcycles, and a slightly yellower color temperature would have been better for our roads. Now, some of you are bound to say that the tank isn't that iconic Pulsar tank anymore. In fact, that was the first reference I made in my opening, right? So yes, it is still not that shape. They've not carried that over. They have not retained that iconic shape. However, what they've done is actually more function than form. Now they finally have a sportier tank. You have these knee recesses. So whether you're braking or going into a corner on either of these motorcycles, this really helps. It gets you a good grip of the tank. But between the legs, the Pulsar doesn't feel as big as it used to earlier, especially the 220F. If you're coming from that to the F250, it doesn't feel as big, it doesn't feel as huge, it doesn't have that big bike feel. And let me know, what do you think about that? People are on the fence about it. Some people like a compact sporty motorcycle, while some would want a 250cc motorcycle to feel like a big bike. Let me know what you think in the comments. The tank capacity is 14 litres, which is on par with the competition, and our tests show that a 500 km range from either of the Pulsar 250s seems achievable. The tank interfaces with the new split seat arrangement far better than the previous Pulsars. The narrow seat and its low placement of 795mm should also make it easy for most male and female riders. Now, compared to the 220, the cornering clearance on the F250, or even that motorcycle for that matter, is slightly better. Slight bit of improvement. I don't have the actual figures, but they have slightly improved it. But for a street bike that is probably not going to hit the racetrack often, for winding roads, for going around twisties, that cornering clearance is pretty good. You would have to really lean the bike at its extremes to be able to start scraping those foot pegs and get into a hairy situation. But it's not that big a problem is what I feel, at least with the riding that we've done today. Of course, on the racetrack, that cornering clearance is not going to be enough because the motorcycle, the chassis is actually quite capable of leaning quite a bit. Probably what will restrict you are those tires. Out of the box, out on the road, they work really well. Under braking also, they work really well. But around the racetrack or around really good switchbacks or winding roads where you're looking at extreme leans, that is where they will start giving way. The ground clearance and the wheelbase are comparable to the 220F, and Bajaj has stuck to slimmer tyre profiles than the competition to safeguard the easily flickable nature of the Pulsars. The N250 in particular is very sharp on the turn-ins and can give the 200 NS a run for its money, despite using a tubular cradle frame instead of a perimeter frame that does duty on the NS or RS. Its slightly rear bias weight distribution allows you to put more weight on the front and still enter corners very confidently. The F250 on the other hand, with its quarter fairing, achieves an almost 50-50 weight bias, making fast corner entries feel relatively more stable than its naked sibling. While the rider geometry on both the bikes is comparable, the F250 needs you to reach out for the handlebars slightly more. The Grimeca brakes, they are a part of the Endurance package now. Endurance is a company that provides Bajaj with the suspension setup, and they bought over Grimeca last year, and that is why they make their way onto this motorcycle, because that helps Bajaj control the costs. The Bibre was made by Brembo, there was royalty involved. Obviously, that was a more expensive braking hardware. So how is this braking hardware? I think I don't have any complaints with it. The front especially is nice and sharp. It's not too grabby, it's not unnerving. It's nice and sharp, whether you're riding in the traffic, out on the highway, braking at highway speeds, or simply braking for your nice sport riding around the winding roads. I think it works really well. We also did a few laps of the Bajaj test track in the morning, and even over there with cold tires, it worked really well. The rear brake, on the other hand, it's not as strong, but I think because this is a single channel ABS setup, it's okay. It will not lock up that easily. So the way they have distributed the brake bias, I think they have done a good job. The tuning is really good. As far as the single channel ABS goes, that of course is the elephant in the room. They ought to have gone with a dual channel ABS, at least on the flagship Pulsar. Unfortunately, they haven't done that. Why they have gone with the single channel ABS, however, is that they tell us that in terms of stunting, the single channel ABS actually works better. Let me know, what are your thoughts about that? Answer in the comments below. Simple two-finger braking is usually enough to get a good tip in for fast corner entry. And a smooth fueling and well-tuned gearing ensures that maintaining steady throttle through the corner and powering out quickly is easily achievable. It still runs a twin spark ignition and not a triple spark ignition. The reason for that is they are able to achieve the air-fuel ratio that they want for the current emission norms, and with the twin spark ignition they are able to get the kind of emissions that they want to be in those norms. So they don't need a triple spark ignition at all. Secondly, the engine, if you look at it, it's a little bit straighter now, 10 degrees straighter than the 220's engine. And with that, the packaging has become a challenge. So they can't really package 3 spark plugs is what they say. because of the repositioning or that change in the angle of the engine, the airbox has moved, the battery has moved. So the battery is now right here below the rear seat. So accessing the battery is not a problem at all in case you need to charge it if you park it. Unfortunately, if there is another way of lockdowns and you need to park your bike off and you want to charge the battery, it's going to be a lot easier now. Same way, if you look in the front, this is where the airbox goes. It's a flat airbox now. It's not, well, why should we call it an airbox? Because it's not a big airbox. Underneath this little panel is a flat air filter. So essentially, a lot of people who grew up with us wanted to put those big conical filters in the airbox that also change the sound character of the motorcycle quite a bit. Unfortunately, that is now going to be very difficult to do. This is where the airbox goes, so it's not going to be that easy. But in terms of the sound, well, it sounds quite good on its own. Let me give you a quick listen. So well, it does sound quite good. If you also notice, there are two ports on that exhaust canister, and that is essentially done to reduce the NVH levels, the vibration levels that come from the exhaust side of things. Overall, the engine, it sees a massive reduction in the NVH levels, especially if you have ridden the previous generation of the Pulsars, the older generation of the Pulsars. Compared to that, this new 250 is a very refined engine. To that effect, the 249cc single features an offset crank and a spring-loaded final drive for the balancer shaft. Even the fuel injection system hardly makes a sound on the boot up. Though the engine isn't as quick as its rivals on outright acceleration, it is tuned for a flat torque curve, which ensures that you can power out of corners or pull overtakes at city and highway speeds in a quick, predictable manner. On the highway, the engine is geared to cruise comfortably at about 110 km an hour at 8000 rpm, and the pull from 100 to 120 is excellent too. Like its rivals, riding past 130 takes some effort as the engine loses steam. But with the wind in your favor, seeing 140 on the clock is possible. In terms of the cruise speed, the N250 achieves a top whack of 130, while the F250, with the aid of its fairing, manages 133, which is about 12 km an hour more than the true top speed of the 220F. The fairing and the windscreen are only marginally better at wind deflection though, and should you go touring, you will need a screen that is more upright to cut the wind blast after 110. Long distances in the saddle of these Pulsars don't feel cumbersome at all, and the suspension complements that comfort further. They've moved to a monoshock suspension at the rear, and it isn't a gas-charged shock, but the ride quality is simply phenomenal, both at the rear and also at the front. You do not have a mismatch of the suspension in any way, whether you're cornering, whether you're simply taking a pillion for a long ride on the highway, or you're doing your regular chores on the motorcycle in the city. It just works really well. In fact, the suspension travel has also gone up compared to the 220, and despite that, there is not a pronounced nosedive under braking. Yes, there is dive. It's still a slightly squishy suspension in terms of the overall setup. It's not too stiff, it's not too taut like maybe say a KTM, but it's never too soft or too squishy when it comes to sport riding. It doesn't take away from any of that fun, but the gains in terms of ride quality are simply phenomenal. So be it sport touring around winding roads, doing the occasional track days, or simply enjoying these machines on the road, the new Pulsars have all the bases covered that made their predecessors such a hit. If you think about it, the Pulsar brand is now older than most of the riders that are actually going to buy either of these 250s. And that new age customer is likely to expect a lot more from a motorcycle of this order. But if you again think about it, apart from the single channel ABS, the kit is actually on par with most of its rivals, and yet the pricing is very accessible. Of course, in today's times of easy monthly installments, a bit more kit for a bit more money would probably not have pinched the buyer all that much. But then again, if you look at the kit, I think the Pulsar is still a very value for money package. So from that point of view, it still makes power accessible for the rider at a very good price. So from that perspective, it's still very much a Pulsar in its design, in its performance, and also in its character.